Fabia, thank you for talking with me today about neurodiversity in the classroom. We've had great conversations on this topic in the past between the two of us, and I'm happy to bring this topic to more people who should hear about the work you're doing. So could you briefly introduce yourself, what you do at OU, and how you became interested in the topic of neurodiversity and disability as it relates to higher education and teaching and learning?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me to have this chat with you. My name is Fabia Battistuzzi. I'm an associate professor in biology, and I'm also an associate dean in the College of Arts and Sciences. What I do in my field, in my research field, is evolution. I'm an astrobiologist and an evolutionary biologist, which means that a lot of my work is actually computationally based. And the reason why this is important to me is because while I kind of stumbled into the computational world, not on purpose, it just happened during my graduate studies. But over the years, I have learned to appreciate the advantage of being in a computational world and how this can translate into accessibility and inclusion for students for a variety of students, honestly, students who may not want to be involved in experimental science for a variety of reasons, or students who cannot be involved in experimental science, again, for a variety of reasons, and in many cases is different types of disabilities. So once I made this realization, I started thinking about how this field and the computational sciences in general can be used to retain students who are interested in STEM, but don't necessarily see themselves as being the stereotypical scientist with the lab white coat, actually I should say the white lab coat. And so that's kind of where all of this started. And then I happened to have a student in my lab, an undergraduate student in my lab, who was a wheelchair user, and she also had service dog. And because of this, she was trying to find a place to do research, but obviously wet labs, it's doable, but it's a little more complex. And so she ended up joining my lab, and I kind of saw science through her eyes and the eyes of her service dog. And I started seeing how much more we could do to promote this kind of science to students that don't necessarily think of it in those terms. So that's how I landed with the neurodiversity community. Yeah, and I'm kind of looking forward to continue those conversations.
What I love about that story in particular is similar stories of how people gain interest in neurodiversity is that first that you see an opportunity, an additional open access door that not everyone may recognize. But then also the story of working with someone where you would normally see these environments or conditions as an automatic door closer. And then you see by offering one additional option that a student who might have otherwise been shut out of an opportunity not only has the opportunity, but they thrive within that. So I think that that is really inspiring in this
I agree.
context.
And the beauty of that story to me is that this student graduated and went on to do a master's degree in California. She's been very, very successful. She's very happy in her career, and she remained into the sciences, which is what I really love to hear.
And then you also start to picture all of the other students who could have a very similar experience should there not automatically be a door closed or
Yep.
a realization that another door can be opened
Mm-hmm.
because we're used to seeing science be one thing, which I know is something that you've talked about a lot. So in particular, I know that you've recently had an experience being a mentor in a STEM program for neurodivergent students. So could you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Sure. So this was through a program funded by NASA. It's the NASA Neurodiversity Network, which is a program that is meant to connect mentors in the sciences with self-identified neurodivergent students who are high school students of different levels. So the student that I worked with was actually a senior and starting college in the fall. So I actually worked with him basically during the summer between his senior year and the start of college for him. Um, so it's a program that I found very interesting because it was the first program that I knew of that was targeted to this community specifically. And the goal really was to provide a research experience to these students. And to be honest, not just because they are neurodivergent and may have some difficulties sometimes in finding other opportunities, but also because in general, high school students, for them, it's not always easy to find a research experience, but it's actually something that really helps them during their college career. And so that's how I decided to participate in this program as a mentor. And the other aspect of it is that I had a chance to talk to the directors of the program, and part of the program at the beginning was actually an orientation for the mentors. I think at the beginning there is always a little bit of anxiety from the mentor's side on, kind of self-doubt. How am I going to do more harm than good if I interact with students that have certain requirements that I may not be aware of? So for me, it was very important to know that there was that support and that mentorship for me, first and foremost, to be able to be prepared to be a good mentor for this student.
So, and I think that, and throughout this conversation, I know in the conversation preparing for this, we talked about where are the lessons learned as far as what you did and how it can translate to different disciplines, different size classrooms, things like that. And so I think my first takeaway from that is that first we need to support educators, teachers, instructors to feel equipped to support neurodivergent students. And that isn't always having comprehensive knowledge on everything you might encounter, how to do everything, say everything in exactly the right way, but perhaps having enough knowledge and enough support that you can appreciate what a student brings to the learning environment that you may not have thought of, but you can also be prepared for some of the challenges that they may experience, either because it's related to a condition or disability, or because they've been in an environment that hasn't been, as supportive of brains that think differently. So I think that's the first takeaway I hear
Yep.
from that, is that you have to start by supporting the educators, which we're hoping that conversations and learning opportunities like this help to provide, but that hopefully that's an ongoing support given to anyone who wants to be, more acknowledging of, the neurodiversity of any group of people.
Right, exactly. I think that is really important, and also knowing from the faculty perspective, giving them the opportunity of having that support throughout the program. So the mentoring is not something that happens at the beginning, one and done. You are on your own now. But it's also knowing that there is somebody, if a situation comes up that you don't necessarily know how to deal with, or if you simply want to talk about it with somebody else that has seen a lot of different situations, and you can you can learn from their experience, knowing that that connection is there.
So once you receive this initial support, training, however you would call it, preparation to start actively mentoring and providing this research experience for a student. Can you tell us a little bit about what the actual mentorship and research experience was like with the student you were assigned to?
Sure. So for the way the program was set up, the student was supposed to perform research. And so it started with me writing short description of the research project, which is kind of standard, right? Think of an abstract for a scientific paper. That's sort of the type of description that was expected. So nothing new to a scientist, standard procedure. And then I met virtually with the student. And because obviously the student was a minor, also with the parent, so there was also this connection of with the family to kind of talk about what the interest of the student was and how the student saw the connection with the project that I proposed. And we found out fairly quickly that we had a lot of interest in common because the student was also interested in the computational side of things. And so I kind of figured that that's why I was paired with that student. And so the project was designed with that in mind. But that was a connection for us that was pretty easy to establish because we were both working towards that kind of research. So then the next step was to set up a structure for us to work together. And the one thing that I was told during my my training and that I realized was very, very true is that one thing that is really helpful is having very structured setting. For example, we agreed upon a meeting time. In our case, it was biweekly because it worked better for everybody's schedule, but it was always the same day, same time. But with the caveat that I talked to him about is, sometimes things happen and I may have to shift our meeting, just letting them know ahead of time that this could potentially happen. The student was very, very good at communicating via email, which is also my preferred communication method because I basically leave attached to my email. So that made it also simple in that sense. If he had to modify or I had to modify, I knew that I could just send an email to let the student know, and the student could do the same with me. So kind of the first step was sort of establishing the communication structure that we would have throughout the summer, because this was a multi-month kind of research. Once we got that figured out, we actually went into the details of the project. What was the student supposed to do? What were my expectations and what were his expectations? For me, in general, with all of my students, it's really important for me to know what they expect out of a research experience. Because obviously, I have projects in mind that need to get done, but the way you do certain projects can change a little bit so that I can tailor the project to the interest of the student. And I know personally from my own experience, if you're happy with your research, the research happens. If you're not happy with it, it doesn't happen. So it is in my own interest to make sure that the student is happy so that the research actually gets done, right? It becomes kind of your baby. You want to spend time with it if you like it. So we had that conversation, and that led to a brief outline of the goals. In 2 weeks, we want to be here. In 4 weeks, we want to be there. At the end of the program, we want to be there. The program required a presentation from all the interns at the end. And so the next thing that we discussed was how to prepare him for the presentation, which is stressful for anybody, no matter how long you have been in the field. Giving a presentation is always stressful. And so I wanted to make sure that we had the time to prepare, to practice. And so we kind of worked backwards. Your presentation is this day. Let's make sure that by this day, your slides are set. Let's make sure that we have enough time for you to practice, all that kind of stuff. Things that, to be honest, I do with all of my students, right? The only difference, I would say, in this particular case is that we actually wrote it down instead of just saying it. But it's also because this was a remote kind of mentoring. And so obviously we needed to have, a Google Sheet that we were both looking at to maintain the connections. So it wasn't terribly different from the way I usually mentor students, except for a little bit more structure.
I'm hearing in all of this the importance of structure, really transparency overall, that you're transparent about what you expect, how you operate, what needs to get done, what is the goal of the work that has to be achieved. But then you listened through feedback with the student on questions they might have, what works for them, and you ultimately found a way for it to work with both of you. And while this is something that is a one-on-one situation, I think there are translatable practices here to other learning contexts, and that can, simply being in the habit of being transparent about the things that have to happen, the learning behaviors, communication expectations. And I also really like the point about putting it in writing. This is something that often comes up in creating communication and guided support for students who are neurodivergent or even students with disabilities, that you can't just rely on what's said in class, what's said in a conversation. But if you really want something to happen, you're more likely going to set that person up for success if it is written down and there is a clear plan.
Right, right. A couple of other strategies that I have heard from others in this program that I implemented, and I realized that they did work well, were also, for example, with this student, whenever we communicated via email, instead of sending a new email every time, we always used our initial email when we first met, because that way it was easily searchable. It became familiar because we both knew what the subject line was. It was easy to find, and it became this very long thread of back and forth that allowed both of us to go back maybe a couple of weeks, maybe 4 weeks, to say, okay, what did we say we were going to do before that maybe we haven't gotten to yet, or maybe we found some issues? How did we solve them? Everything was in the same thread, and that kind of made it simpler honestly, for both of us to follow without, getting lost with, okay, when was this email sent? What was the subject line? How am I going to find it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And thinking about, do you want the student you're working with to spend their energy on finding the document or the conversation in one place, or do you want to line things up so that they can easily find the information, so they can spend that energy on the actual learning task? And this is good for anyone, but depending on the students, the nature of the students, neurodivergence. I mean, the disabled community often talks about having a certain amount of spoons in a day. So like a certain capacity to navigate these certain challenges and stresses. So it's, how do you spend those spoons before you run out and you have to shut down?
Right.
So
Right. Which, I mean, the way I see it is, a good practice regardless. For example, when I teach my classes, I encourage my students, if they want to email me and they have a question, put in the subject line the name of the class, because, and I actually write it, I tell them, put, bio 1, 2, 3, 4,
Mm-hmm.
because then I know I can find it and I know your email is not going to get lost. And I do the same when I reply. So I feel like a lot, frankly, is just good practice, especially we are all very busy people and we all
Mm-hmm.
get a lot of emails. It just makes it all so much easier
Mm-hmm.
if we kind of adopt this sort of structure for everyone. For many people is an option, for some people is actually a requirement.
Yes. So I feel like organically a lot of the things that you saw in this experience can be translated to teaching a college classroom, working with a group of students. And I mean, honestly, a lot of the educational experiences at a university are mentoring and are working with a graduate student, figuring out how to structure a project or set the goals in a way that makes everyone happy. So I think there's lots of diverse ways that students are
Hmm.
learning at the university. But I'm wondering if there were any other light bulb moments, any other takeaways that, from the experience that you had in this very specific situation that centered neurodivergence, if there's anything applicable, any takeaways for the rest of us working at our different corners in the university.
I think my biggest outcome of this was to really realize to not be scared to interact with this community. Um, I had that concern, like I mentioned at the beginning. Um, but once I got past that, I actually realized that this student in particular, it was not only was a wonderful experience to work with the student, but it was also extremely productive. Neurodivergent students, at least from the mentoring that we received in this program, they kind of made this generalization. They often hyperfocus, which means that what uh, you know a non-neurodivergent student would get done in a week, for some of the students, it gets done in a day. So I can tell you, for the project that the student did, I have been trying to get this project done for basically 4 months, and the student got it done in 2 months over the summer.
Wow.
So it was amazing. And now I have a tool that all my students are using, and we are super happy. And this student is going to be an author on the paper. And it's just it it really kind of opened my mind to the possibilities, because it's really not a question of, can a neurodivergent student do the work? Is just how can we enable them to do the work? Once that setup is there, these students, they take it and they go, and there's no stopping them. They are way faster than a lot of other people, including myself.
That's wonderful. And I think that I don't want to say anything else because that's such a lovely point to end on. And plus I think there are a lot of wonderful takeaways throughout the conversation that we came to and talking about the progression of your experience. And really you kind of ended up where you were earlier on, which is this message of acknowledging where you're at, not letting that stop you if you have some hesitancy and you realize you need to know more on this topic, that you take advantage of whatever support there is around you to both build up your competence, but also just be there enough to be humble and to just stay in communication with whoever you're working with and meet them where they are and just not shut any doors too soon as far as who you work with and what kind of work you can achieve together.
Yep,
So this has been
exactly.
wonderful. Thank you so much, Fabia, for sharing your story and giving us some nuggets of wisdom.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.